Greetings. When I was a young man, still a witness, I think, I heard of this book, Kenneth Latourette, A History of Christianity, no doubt referenced by the Watchtower, referenced by everybody in those days, that is the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. Basic history of Christianity, so I'm going to put it in the Basic Christian Library section or playlist. Latourette was, at that time that he put this together in its original edition, Sterling Professor of Missions and Oriental History and Fellow of Berkeley College in Yale University, so credentials for historian were not going to be much higher than that. So he writes the history of Christianity, and I remember referencing it several times when I was a witness or a little after I left, and thinking, this is very balanced. It is written, by the way, from a moderately liberal scholarly position, which is normal for Yale University and the mainstream institutions in those days. But that was not a strength when I was a conservative, a very conservative young Christian, but it is a strength now because I realize one of the strengths of liberalism is they're not bound by certain theological doctrines. So it's a balanced approach to many things that I now think of as of utmost importance to every Christian who wants to see what really happened in church history. I'm going to start in a section on page 115, the organization of the early church, of great relevance to those of us who come out of cults, or for that matter even exist in churches where it is just assumed that something went seriously wrong after the first century. So what was the organization of the early church like? Latourette says, the precise forms of the Christian community in the first century or so of its existence have been and remain a topic of debate. This is partly because in subsequent generations Christians sought in the organization of early Christianity the authority for the structure of their particular branch of the church. It is also because the evidence is of such a fragmentary character that on many important issues it does not yield incontestable conclusions. For the first 2 or 3 generations, the Christian community exhibited great variety. There was a consciousness, at least among some of the leaders, of the inclusive unity, which, as we have seen, was the ideal set forth in the New Testament. Yet no central administration existed as the instrument for knitting together the many local units of the church into a single articulated structure. The church in Jerusalem, as the initial center of the Christian fellowship, endeavored to exercise some measure of control, especially on the contested question of the degree to which Christians should conform to the Jewish law. To some extent it was heeded, perhaps after the pattern of the respect shown for the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem by the Jewish communities in various parts of the Gentile world. But it possessed no administrative machinery for extensive oversight. Its authority was more that of prestige than of precise canon law. Under these conditions, no comprehensive or uniform pattern of church practice and government existed. Before the first century of its existence was out, the church began to display certain organizational features which, developed, have persisted, with modifications, into the 20th century. We hear of offices and officials. Prominent among them were deacons, from the Greek diakonos, meaning a servant or minister. Elders, the English translation of the Greek presbyteros, from which the word presbyter is derived, and from which in turn comes the word priest. And bishops, from the Greek episkopos, which with something of the meaning of overseer or superintendent. It was early maintained that the precedent for the deacons was to be found in the 7 who are described as having been appointed by the 12 apostles in the early days of the Jerusalem church to take charge of the daily distribution to the widows from the common store. While the historic continuity between the 7 and the later diaconate has by no means been fully demonstrated, and in the New Testament we never have clear mention of deacons in the church in Jerusalem, it is indisputable that within a generation or two, in some of the local units or churches, deacons were regarded as characteristic officers, and it may have been that women as well as men served in that capacity. The office of presbyter or elder may have been suggested by the organization of the synagogue, where elders were a regular part of the structure. In at least several of the local churches, there was more than one bishop, and the evidence seems to support the view that at the outset, in some and perhaps all of the churches, the designations of elder and bishop were used interchangeably for the same office. Uniformity of structure was far from coming into being at once. In the earliest mention of what appeared to be offices or leaders in the great Gentile church in Antioch, we hear of prophets and teachers, but not of deacons, elders, or bishops. In one of his letters to the church in Corinth, where he appears to be naming the offices in the church, Paul says nothing expressly of deacons, elders, or bishops, although some of his words can be so interpreted. But he does speak of apostles, prophets, and teachers. In his letter to the Romans, prophets, ministers, teachers, exhorters, givers, perhaps deacons, and rulers are named as what appears to be the order with which Paul is familiar. In another letter, the list is apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. In the first generation of the church in Jerusalem, James, the brother of Jesus, was regarded as its head, but not until later was the title of bishop attached to him. It's also clear that the church in Jerusalem had elders. It is likewise obvious that Paul exercised jurisdiction over the churches which he had founded. Whoever the author may be of the letters which bear the traditional designation of the first and second epistles of John, and this is much in dispute, he calls himself the elder, and as such writes with acknowledged authority. He also speaks of a certain Diotrephes as loving preeminence in a church and refusing to recognize the power of the author. So Latourette will go on to discuss the development of structure within the church in the first generations next time and beyond. So this is the first of a series, and there's lots of things to work with here in this 1,500-page masterwork, which, by the way, was later released in 2 paperback volumes, so I think you could still obtain it fairly easily. I'll put a link in to B.F. Westcott, who wrote one of the most famous commentaries on Hebrews, where Westcott remarks upon the lack of organization in those early churches.